Welcome to the Chaos Sector. Everyone is wondering who the informant is for the prosecution. Well, let's think about it. We mentioned prior, the trial will always keep getting pushed back, delayed, times and dates changed, motions filed and motions denied. The procedures in that courtroom, mainly from the prosecution, is a reflection of how the investigation was handled. There is no informant. It's a bluff. The bluff is to convince the judge and jury, the mainstream media, and the public that there is someone out there who knows Kohberger is responsible for those murders. But there is a chance they do have an informant. Yet there is a question. Where was this informant all of last year? There was no mention of an from the prosecution before recently. Informants are used when there isn't overwhelming evidence against a defendant. In this case specifically, no evidence of stalking those housemates, no surveillance provided, showing the defendant was there 12 times prior, and actually no surveillance provided showing the defendant entered the neighborhood. We don't include the Linda Lane surveillance for reasons we explained, so the informant would know something about Kohberger that supports or ties him to not only physically being in that home but also being the killer. The problem with this informant is, what type of an informant are we talking about here? There are 4 types of informants. Let's define them briefly. Citizen informants. These people provide information to police about a crime they have witnessed or heard about without any expectation of compensation. They may come forward because they want to do the right thing or because they are worried about retaliation if they don't. Police confidential informants. These are informants who provide information to the police in exchange for something else. Sometimes, these informants are accused of a crime and are looking to bargain for leniency in exchange for cooperation. Typically, they are people in close contact with criminal activity who exchange information for cash, or they may have something similar to gain by ratting out someone else. Jailhouse informants. These are usually jail inmates who talk to a target defendant directly or overheard them talking to someone else. They are called a jailhouse snitch and usually seek lenient treatment for their information. Perkins informants. This is when law enforcement plants someone inside a jail cell with the target defendant to get some statement from them to be used in their prosecution. Now, if they do actually have an informant, it's more than likely number 3 or number 4, meaning this is someone who is incarcerated in the same county jail as Kohberger. The problem with these types of informants is there are negotiations between law enforcement and the inmate, which can lead to the judge and jury, and obviously the defense, questioning the integrity of their accounts. But isn't Kohberger in protective custody while incarcerated? Oh yeah, that's right. He has no communication with any other inmates under maximum security, so the chances he uttered anything to anyone regarding his charges are highly unlikely, which actually brings this back to the free world. Now, this also brings back the question, where was this informant prior in the investigation? If it's number 2, a typical informant we know of in society, there was no information provided that would be key information about Kohberger from that informant. And it's definitely not number 1, which is basically a citizen who witnessed something that would have already been revealed. It has to be someone that is already incarcerated, who is the so-called informant. Nevertheless, it's still considered a bluff because there's nothing that would be considered exculpatory evidence against Kohberger, because it would have already been established and reported as evidence. Remember, Howard Blumenthal claimed that the authorities had provided the prosecution, who had in turn provided the jury, with a receipt of Kohberger purchasing a Myers jumpsuit. Then you have the mainstream media discussing this, where the prosecution was reviewing Amazon purchase history and even trying to track the fucking clicks that Kohberger made on the website. We went over that. Just derpness. What about Blumenthal being interviewed, claiming the housemates were texting each other during the attacks and even the murders? The mainstream media also reported on this. But is this what the prosecution discovered? Is this what Moscow PD discovered? Well, it sure didn't get reported on early in the case. As we mentioned, the prosecution would throw Dylan and Bethany all the way under the bus, without hesitation. And it might be a form of preventive measures as well. Let me explain. If they come out and state that Dylan and Bethany were texting each other during the attacks, it helps make the setting more realistic, as opposed to them somehow not knowing their housemates were being massacred. One would say, wait, why wasn't this reported earlier in the investigation? Aha, here's the Jedi mind trick to that claim. Slick, but not slick enough. You need more WD-40, as the saying goes. They're actually throwing Dylan under the bus more so because Bethany never provided any real information in her affidavit that determined anything that night. But they have to keep Bethany paired with Dylan because, we went over this. Dylan is the conspirator in that house that night. And if Dylan is exposed as being aware of the attacks and murders by herself, then her affidavit is thrown out of the window quicker than a licking lizard found in your kitchen. Keep in mind, the defense is actually sitting on this affidavit. It will be challenged due to the conflicting information. Now, do you see why the prosecution is sweating bullets? They know the defense has Dylan's affidavit, and they also know the defense is aware of a different setting in the home that Dylan told a private investigator. That creates a setting where Dylan is aware of the attacks and murders based on the affidavit. Everything she provided in the affidavit would be transformed to knowing her housemates were being attacked and murdered. No mention of Bethany in her affidavit, because we came to the conclusion Bethany got out of there. And the prosecution needs them together to prevent the trail of evidence being revealed to the real killers. This is a chess game. And at this very moment, the defense is sitting on a game-over move, and the prosecution is trying to figure out what that move will be. But they have to make the next move, yet are too concerned about what the opponent will do next. So to keep Dylan from being guilty of either accessory to the crime or even an actual key component of the crime, they had to pair Bethany with Dylan to take the pressure off of her. But they're not. Bethany's whereabouts were provided, it was reported. She was at the Sigma Chi party. Doesn't matter if she left early, stayed longer, in comparison to Dylan, whose whereabouts didn't have an actual location of where she was that night. We have one person somewhere specifically, and another somewhere that has a question mark above it. Can you imagine the defense inquiring about this claim about the housemates in trial? Somebody will be called in to testify. That's a very dangerous aspect for the prosecution. To the judge and jury, I call Miss Dylan Mortensen to the stand. To the judge and jury, I call Miss Funk to the stand. Their accounts are definitely not going to be the same. We simulated how her testimony would be shredded to pieces based on conflicting accounts. And Moscow PD is also fair game. They could also be called in to testify. The defense would ask the officer who questioned Dylan, obtaining the information. Mr. Officer, can you explain why one of the housemates, being Miss Mortensen, why wasn't her whereabouts provided, but every other housemate was, including down to their physical activity? Can you explain why her whereabouts were not provided in the police report? Do you think it's fair that her whereabouts were concealed? Doesn't law enforcement pride themselves on being transparent with the public, the people they serve and protect? This separates them also in the house, because Bethany's whereabouts verify where she was and when she got home. And also no accounts of hearing or witnessing anything that night, while Dylan's whereabouts could literally be still at the house, waiting, plotting with the killers, and then leaving when the attacks and murders happened, then coming back with her little criminal boyfriend, Bonnie, as the DoorDash driver, and Clyde, all come back after the murders had occurred. Let me not get off track. You get the point here, though, right? So the prosecution is just building up more made-up evidence, which only magnifies that they don't actually have any evidence, and I mean whatsoever. The only thing they may have is some sort of relative link between Kohberger and the motive behind the murders. And if you followed the chaos, we basically concluded that Kohberger saw too much and had become a target for what he witnessed. Funny how things work. The accused killer is actually a witness. Fucking bonkers.
What does the informant actually know? That would be exculpatory evidence for the prosecution. Furthermore, why would the prosecution rely on an informant's statements at this stage of the case, when they have already so-called placed Kohberger at the scene of the crime with his DNA? They identified his vehicle in surveillance and have claimed he stalked those housemates. You have his DNA at the scene of the crime, you have his vehicle in the neighborhood that night, and you have the motive, which was a stalker. An informant is not needed, because at this stage in the case, Kohberger would have already been sentenced to the death penalty with that evidence. But of course, the trial is being dragged along. Why? Because they don't have the actual evidence they need to prove he was guilty. For those who have not been following, let's break it all down again. The most important evidence the prosecution would have is not the DNA on the knife sheath. In general, that is the most important evidence a prosecution could have, but not so fast, my friends. It's actually the surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera. Again, we break it down again. If this surveillance footage would reveal a white vehicle, which would be more accurately identified due to the wider range of visibility, if this vehicle would be spotted entering the neighborhood around that 3:30 a.m. timeframe, then departing around 4:25 a.m., this is the most concrete evidence they could ever have. Yet, it has never been provided. I think the white vehicle entered and departed contrary to the time they claimed the murders occurred, meaning, going back to the Oregon Trail, there was a white Hyundai Elantra, but it wasn't Kohberger's. And due to this, the most important evidence you could observe, which would be of Kohberger's vehicle entering the neighborhood, can't show Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra. Rather, it would show someone else's white Hyundai Elantra, which contradicts the time of death. We suggested that this was the white vehicle in the gas station, imagery, because it was obviously edited. Now, we recently viewed Murder Mayhem's stream with a few guests such as A.R. Hayes and Lucky, and Mayhem pointed out a key element to that vehicle we didn't even think about: gas. Yes, the perpetrator, before leaving Moscow, filled up the tank, then headed out of town. They had a long drive, of course, to Oregon, and this is where they just dumped the vehicle. We suggested that this was the so-called private driver who had claimed to stop off at Taco Bell after dropping the girls off that night. Well, there's a Taco Bell on Blaine Street, near that gas station on White Avenue. The path is logical: stop off at Taco Bell as some sort of alibi, stop off at the gas station and fill up, and get the heck out of town. By the way, the private driver is apparently like 3 different people who drove Kaylee and Maddie home that night. You have Eric Grower, don't know who that is. Then you have Eric Gower, which is highly unlikely. Then you have who we nicknamed Batman, who was interviewed by Law and Crime as the private driver. Batman claimed to spot Kohberger's vehicle around December 7th and claimed he stayed 1,200 feet from his doorstep. Being so specific with that distance, it's obvious Batman was trying too hard in convincing the public of his accounts. Nothing but a bunch of fuckery. In the police report, the private driver claimed he stopped off at Taco Bell after dropping the girls off. There is obviously some impersonating going on here, because there are different people depicted as one person.
And guess what Eugene PD didn't do during that time frame of searching for a 2011 to 2013 model? They didn't, I repeat, they didn't disclose the year of that white Hyundai Elantra. Now, isn't that just peachy? Can't have an authentic murder investigation if authorities are concealing the damn crashed and abandoned white Hyundai Elantra, the same vehicle and year authorities were searching for in the murder investigation. And of course, some have claimed that very white Hyundai Elantra was tied to the owner of the victim's home. It actually was a trail back to the owner. I mean, damn, can we get like a vaccine for common sense injected into some people? That's for the individual who mentioned vaccines for stupidity. Yeah, you got a shout out, now go get the common sense vaccine. In a nutshell, we went over the nonsense of the trial. Bill Thompson was apparently agitated by a survey the defense provided to a potential jury pool. Translation: you don't get to persuade the jury. We are the ones who have the right to brainwash them into think your client is the monster. So, it's obvious the trial's a bunch of nonsense. We would rather stick to the physical elements of the case, such as Dot's claims, or better yet, the neighbor's claims, for Nick too bad for you. Are you and others paying attention? Now don't get lost in focusing on Dot speaking. Focus on what she is speaking about. Also, we don't feel the need to address Dot's sexual orientation, gender, none of that. It's not important to the case. Hopefully, many can focus on the setting rather than the person providing the setting. After all, the physical setting is what we all are trying to piece together. This is the Chaos Sector.